You ready? Yeah. Excellent. Good evening. Welcome to this Ask Me Anything with Saj Hussain regarding property. So ask me your property questions. That's really what this session is for. Run for about half an hour. I'm trying to do them every Monday at 8:30 p.m. as a live on various different platforms. So whether you're on a Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram or Twitter, hopefully you'll get some value from this. So if you've got any questions around property, your property investing journey, regardless of where you are, I'm not saying I know all the answers, I have the answers to everything. I certainly don't. But what I'll do is I'll share with you any experience I can, any knowledge that I have on that for you, on that particular question that you have. So what I'll do, I'll start with some of the questions I didn't get to finish last week when we were running this. So I'll start with those. In the meantime, start putting your question in. And my lovely assistant Khalid over there will kind of pick up any questions and pass them across to me, and I'll get those answered for you. So we'll start with this one first. This was a question on LinkedIn by Abdi Hakim. And his question was, build to rent versus build to sell. What do you think is better? Well, I'd say it depends on what it is ultimately you're trying to achieve. What's the outcome? What's the end goal you're trying to achieve? That's usually where I'd start with. I'd say start with the outcome in mind. Get absolutely clear where it is that you want to get to before you start on any particular type of strategy. So for instance, if the goal is to create income and to build up assets, then it might be a build to rent, or if the objective is to create chunks of cash at the end of it, that might be a build to sell. So I'm building some houses right now, and the intention with them is to sell them. They're quite high-end luxury houses, 5-bedroom, double garages, that type of thing. So those will not work as a build to rent. So my outcome with that is simply just to build them, sell them, take the profit, and move on to the next project. Now, if you're looking at build to rent, what you need to be thinking about is how much profit are you creating, or how much equity are you going to be able to create in the project that you're doing? I'd say ordinarily looking for around 30%, between 25 and 30% would be the range in terms of how much uplift you're creating, how much profit in that deal. So at the end of it, let's say, for example, the whole thing has cost you £750,000. And if the end value is £1 million, you could refinance the whole site at the end of it on a 75% loan to value mortgage from a lender and draw down £750,000. That means effectively you've got all your money back out. In theory, that's essentially what you're doing with a build to rent. And then you've got your profit is built in as equity or a deposit, if you like, within that site. And then you're making cash flow from that particular site as well as on site for the long term. So it depends, I would say, Abdi, what the outcome is that you want to achieve. I say they both work. It depends what you're doing and where you're doing it. So for example, let's say if you're in a lower social demographic area where there's low value properties, a lot of the properties might be, say, social housing or owned by the local authority. If you're building luxury high-end houses there to sell, that may not work so well. So it's thinking about what you're building, where you're building, and who it's for as well. That comes after getting very clear what your outcome and your strategy is. So making sure that site that you're creating is going to work on the location that you have in mind. So hopefully, Abdi, that answers your question. So I'm going to jump onto my next question here, which is from YouTube. This is from Kreber. Is no money down possible? I answered this question in some depth, I think, recently. But in a nutshell, when we talk about no money down, what we're essentially saying is none of your money is going into that deal to acquire the property. Now, when you're acquiring a property, you're purchasing property, it requires some kind of money. You could control property for small amounts of money. For example, you could have a property, say, on an option contract, a lease option. You could have a rent to rent, a rent to HMO, a rent to service accommodation. All these are methods of control. They're not ownership. You don't own the property, but you control the asset to be able to extract profit from it. So some people may talk about that as a way of saying no money down, where you're not putting a huge amount of money down, but you're controlling an asset and making money from it. When it comes to ownership, let's say you're typically you're purchasing a property, it's a buy to let, you'll put down a 25% deposit and get 75% mortgage. Ordinarily, that's most people would do. And so that means 25% of your money's gone in, 75,000 or 75% rather is come from the bank. Let's assume it's £100,000 purchase price. So 75,000 from the bank, 25,000 from you, that's £100,000. So your money that's gone in is the £25,000 deposit. Plus you'll have other things like the solicitor's cost, stamp duty, mortgage lender fees, maybe broker fees, valuation, etc., etc., etc. Now, if it was possible to borrow all of the money, i.e. the full £100,000 for that particular property, then effectively that's no money down. You're not putting any of your money down. The whole thing is being leveraged. All the money is being borrowed to be able to do that transaction. So if we go back to say pre-2007, 2006, 5, around that kind of era, there were lots of no money down type strategies that were going on where people were purchasing property. This is actually purchasing, but not using any of their money. There was all bank money. The bank was giving you 100% loan, or there was various ways to be able to extract all the money back out, such as same-day remortgaging, as it was called. Now, if you're thinking about 100% mortgages, is that even possible? Well, Northern Rock would not only give you 100% of what you need, they'd give you then some. There was in excess of 100, 110, 120% loans were available at that time to purchase property and get some. This craziness is what led to the kind of whole economy crashing at that time, because everything was kind of over geared. So when you think about today, is it still possible to do those strategies? Well, not those specific products, because they don't exist. They're not available right now. Those structures are not possible to do, but there's still ways to purchase property for no money down. So if I've got an amazing deal, if I've got a really good deal, I can always go and find somebody who's got the funds who can fund that deal. They can fund it in its entirety. Effectively, it's no money down for me. Now, there needs to be something in it for the person that's funding it for you. But in short, there's many, many different ways that you can acquire property without actually putting down any of your own money. And we're not talking about deceiving or lying to lenders. This is really just being about creative, about how you can actually go about doing that. So I hope that gives you kind of a little bit of an overview. I mean, I could spend 2 or 3 hours just trying to explain that. If there's any specifics you've got on that, just pop me another question. I'm happy to answer that for you. So next question here. So Andy Lynch's question on LinkedIn. Do you think HMOs are becoming saturated? It's a great question. So people talk about, is the HMO market now saturated and is it changed? Well, I've been in HMOs about 10 years now. When I first started, it was the, if you'd imagine the room, magnolia wood chip paint, not too dissimilar to this. You'd have your wood chip magnolia walls. You would have a pine bed in the corner, the blue stripy mattress. That typically was what a lot of bedsit type HMOs were about. And all we had to do at that moment in time was just create something a little bit nicer, dress it, and nice little fluffy cushions on the bed. No, hey presto, all of a sudden you had something that was nicer than most of the other products out there in the marketplace. But the market's moved on significantly. It's moving all the time. I was just with my chiropractor this morning, and while he was cricking me into position, we're talking about HMOs and how the market's just moved significantly over the last few years and continues to do so. And we need to be ready to adapt with that change as well. So when we think about 10 years ago, we think about now where the market is and what's changed and what's happening, the standards have risen significantly. The quality of accommodation is much higher. So let's say we're assuming we're talking about, say, professional tenants that we're targeting. So whether you're in Birmingham, as I am, or somewhere else in the country, as many other people I speak to around the country have similar views on this as well, that the standards are now much higher and the market's more competitive, and we have to work that little bit harder to let our rooms. See, what's also happened over that time is, although the demand for this type of accommodation has increased, but probably supply has outstripped demand. So people are bringing good quality accommodation to the market much faster than the pace of demand is in the marketplace for this type of accommodation. That's why the type of accommodation is evolving now into these stylish quality houses where people want to live and be in that environment rather than maybe go and rent a flat or a studio. So this in some places is causing saturation where there's way too many rooms available versus how many people are looking. If you take a step back and think about what got people interested in HMOs, well, when the market crashed, kind of 2007, 2008, at that time, people were doing a lot of single lets, i.e. family houses or flats, or buying off plan or buying no money down, and that was a strategy people were following. But when the market changed, what people needed was cash flow. They needed to create cash flow, and yes, they could rent a house out, collect a little bit of profit, 100 quid, 150 quid from that property each month, but that's not going to be very much cash flow. And this is where people start looking at what the other things we could be doing. What other ways can we squeeze more profit out of that property? And that's what made HMOs much more desirable over time, and more people started doing those. Hence, the supply into the marketplace has increased quite significantly. So to answer your question in short, is the market saturated? Well, the only answer I can give you, well, it depends. It depends where you are and what sector of the market you're in. So as I said, when we talk about HMOs, we're assuming they're professionals, but it could be students, it could be social housing. There's many different types of HMOs that we're talking about. So it's important to look at the figures within your area, i.e. how many properties are being marketed, say for example on Spare Room, how many people are looking for those rooms, talk to other people that are letting rooms, how are they finding the market, talk to people who are taking to let a room and become your potential tenant. How are they finding the market? So when they're going out, they're looking at, they're finding there's enormous amounts of choice. Are they finding that the landlord being flexible and reducing the price just to get somebody in? Are the landlords being flexible that they're lowering the criteria just to get somebody in and get that room let? If they are, then that's an indication that the market's become saturated. So personally speaking, in Birmingham, I think the market's changing. I don't think we're at saturation. I don't think we're anywhere close to saturation, but I do feel some parts of the market are much more competitive than others. So it can be a little bit unpredictable. There were usually certain times of the year where it was quieter and it was busier, but now we find that it changes, it evolves, those patterns aren't necessarily there. There's the traditional ones like, for us this time of the year, December, tends to get very quiet. There's fewer people that want to move, fewer people want to move into new accommodation, so we have less of a churn. And then in August, September, October, it tends to be very busy because many of our tenants are former graduates, so it comes to that time of the year where they're leaving university, they may be moving to a new job, or they've left university and they still want to live with somebody else. So this is what's created the demand and the peaks within the marketplace. But if you're doing your research in August, looking to see whether the market's saturated, you'll think, oh my God, the market's amazing. There's so many people looking for rooms. We could supply more property. But you have to measure it across the board and not in isolation. So don't just take something out of context to be able to assess whether it's been oversupplied or the market's just been saturated with property, or whether it's more balanced. So hopefully it gives you an idea, Andy. That's kind of my view on that. So the next question we've got is also on LinkedIn, which is Abbas Sheikh. Have you done rent to rent? Yes, lots of them, lots of rent to rent deals, mostly probably about 7, 8 years ago. Around that time, I was doing a lot more rent to rents, and probably about 6, 7 years ago, I was teaching a lot of rent to rent strategies and how to actually go and find a property and get them up and running. And in essence, yes, rent to rent is a great stepping stone strategy, as I call it. It's not an end goal strategy for me. An end goal strategy being something you're going to be doing for the long term. A stepping stone strategy is one that you're using just to be able to get moving. So I found this is a great strategy to help people just get started in property and create that income. Sometimes they might have a very busy day job. They might be earning very good money, but they want to try and replace it and build something else. And a fairly fast way of doing that is rent to rent. You take on a property, you're paying a landlord a certain rent, you're effectively subletting the rooms out for much more than what you're paying the landlord. You've got costs, utilities, etc. that you've got to pay, but you end up with a nice chunky profit. And let's say you're making, say, £1,000, which is not difficult to do on the right type of properties. Let's say you're making £1,000, you've got 3 of those. Hey presto, all of a sudden from 3 houses that you don't own, you're earning £3,000 a month, which is more than the average salary in this country, right? So that's why it's a great strategy. The reason I think it should only be used as a stepping stone strategy, because it can be quite time intensive. You need to build the systems. A handful of these you can manage yourself. But if you keep growing, and I've seen this happen many times with people, they grow this huge rent-to-rent portfolio, and then they need all the staff, and the overheads start rising in terms of just being able to manage that, because effectively what you're doing is becoming a letting agent. You'll become a letting agent for other people's properties, but you're making more money on than an ordinary letting agent will do. But you still got all the headache and the responsibilities as you would as a letting agent. And I'm guessing that's probably not what you want to get into the property business for. You want to get into it for the income and the profit. That's what you're looking for. So I think it's a great strategy, but it should be thinking about it as a stepping stone strategy. You build up a bit of income and you move on to another strategy. So I hope that helps. Next question I've got. Just 1 second. This is also on LinkedIn. This is Chamila. How to find a gold mine area for rent to service accommodation. So rent to service accommodation, as we're on the topic of rent to rent, we were talking about rent to HMOs before, where you take on a whole building, you're kind of subdividing it out into individual components, i.e. 5 or 6 bedrooms, and you're letting those rooms out individually. You're bringing in a lot more money than you might be paying the landlord. So that's your rent to HMO. Rent to service accommodation is where you're taking on a property and letting it for short term. It could be literally for one night, it could be a few nights, a week, a few weeks, but not your normal 6-month type tenancy, a much shorter period. And there might be some value add in that as well. For example, cleaning services, linen chain, etc. It's usually fully furnished, not just with your furniture, but also like things like your cutlery, TV, things like this. So a fully serviced an apartment, effectively, which is where the name comes from, SA, service accommodation. Now that is something that will generate much more profit than it would if that same property was let out, say, to a family, and often more profit than it would generate as if you'd broken it into individual rooms and let those rooms out as well. So a very profitable strategy. So the questions around the gold mine area: how do you find the location where this works? Well, if you think about, first of all, who is it you're servicing? You're servicing and providing accommodation for people who are looking to stay somewhere short term. Usually 2 types of people. One is business people that are traveling. The other one might be people that are on leisure. Either they're going to see an area, like tourists visiting, traveling through an area. They're your 2 types of guests. Now, if you think about what are the other options, where would they stay ordinarily? Well, it's usually hotels. That's where most people would stay when they're looking for something like that. And this is where the market's evolved. The likes of Booking.com and Airbnb have completely changed the market space and the landscape, and now allows people, whether they're renting a room in their apartment, in their house, or whether it's a whole property that's been set up specifically for this purpose. So when they build these hotels, spending literally millions and millions of pounds to create these hotels, do you think they may have done a little bit of research to assess how much demand there might be for that type of accommodation? Absolutely, yes. They will definitely have done the research. So you can leverage off that research. One of the easiest ways to assess if there's going to be demand for service accommodation, if there's hotels in the area, hotels very close by, that's a great starting point. I'm not saying that's all your research done, but that's a fantastic starting point to say, right, well, if there's hotels here, they're already providing this type of accommodation. Then you can go onto the platforms, look at what other people are also maybe offering accommodation this way, short stay accommodation that's serviced, and look at how far ahead are they booked. How many bookings have they got? How many nights have they got available? Are they booked for the rest of this month? Do they only have the odd pockets available next month? That gives you a sense for how much demand there is, and also the rates that they're charging. Then you can work out backwards what rates are being charged per night typically for that type of accommodation that you're looking to create. What are the hotels charging? You kind of get a figure for there. And if you did that, say, over 30 days, at like a month, you've got a figure. But here's the thing, you're not going to be occupied every single night. So your occupancy level you need to think about. So if you're thinking about 70-ish%, I think it's been quite realistic. And then assess your figures from there. So let's say it's £30 a night. You do £30 a night times, say, 20 nights. Gives you an idea of what it is that you'll probably generate as a gross income. Remember, you've got running costs, your bills, linen change, cleaning, marketing costs, platform fees, and various other things as well you need to think about. But ultimately, you'll probably make a very good profit on that. So hopefully that answers your question. Let me grab another one here. So this one's on YouTube. This is Alice Aromacare again. From Aromacare. Definitely getting value for money. So can you change a rented commercial office space into service accommodation? Interesting question. So commercial space, so what we're talking about is planning classifications here, essentially. What's the building's use? If it's a commercial space, then it will have a set use, i.e. what that property has permitted uses attached to it, what it can be used for. So for example, if it's, let's just say it's a warehouse, you can't just suddenly turn that into a restaurant. And if it's a restaurant, you can't turn that into a nursery. And if it's a nursery, you can't turn that into a nightclub. without going through the relevant planning changes. Now, service accommodation is one of these grey areas. People have got many different views on this, and this is my view as well that I'm expressing. People got different views on what is it, where does it fit in. Some people will say, well, actually, just like I was explaining earlier on, they really like hotels, so they should be in the hotel classification, like bed and breakfast and guest houses. Maybe it should fall into that classification. Well, some people say, well, no, actually, it's a home that's been available for short stay, somebody's home. Well, then it would be residential, normal kind of C3 type use. So there's a little bit of a grey area. You could maybe talk to your local council, see what their view on it is. What I've found, and from the experience of speaking to many people, often the council don't know what to call this. For instance, the word service accommodation is just a made-up word that's used within the property industry. It's not a dictionary definition. So using slang like that probably won't help when you're speaking to your planning department. But if you explain to them what it is that you're looking to do and allow them to define what they think it is. If you're just testing out a property, a little tick for you, don't tell them the address of the property. Just give a general address and just talk about this is what you're thinking of doing, what classification does it fall into, and you get a sense for the local council's view on how they see that change. So if you had the planning approval, the permissions to be able to change its use, then absolutely, physically, you just got to make the investment to make those changes. There are some permitted development changes that can be done. So, for instance, if it was office space that you had, commercial office space, that can be changed to residential. There are some conditions attached to that, but essentially under prior approval, which means you don't need to go through the full planning process. You could change office space into residential. Once it's residential, if you're of the opinion that actually because it's residential, you can run it as normal short stay, then that's great. If on the other hand, the council disagree, they think it needs to be guest house status, whatever, then you still need to go through the planning process of making that change. So really a lot of it is dependent on what your council views this at, what their understanding of it is, and where you sit in terms of what general people's views are, because there's a lot of grey areas in this, as I mentioned. So question from LinkedIn, Stephen has asked, what's the best way to calculate ROI and yield in an honest way? So another great question. So when I'm speaking to somebody about a deal and they're telling me what the deal is and how they've calculated, and they tell me this is the return on investment or the ROI on it, or the yield, or the return on capital employed, or whatever metric they're using to measure the return, generally what I will do is I'll ask them to explain how they've calculated it. The reason being, because when we talk about yield and ROI, people got, again, different interpretations of what it means and how they calculated it. So I think it's always important to ask the person who's quoting you a yield or ROI or whatever it might be, how they're calculating it. Now, sometimes people might think, well, actually, that's a bit odd. You'd think, well, you're a bit experienced about this, so you should know how this stuff works, right? It's a bit embarrassing asking somebody else how do you calculate it. No, you're asking for sake of clarification, because there's many different ways to do these calculations. So you can quite easily ask, so how is it that which method is it that you use to calculate the return on investment? That's a very soft and gentle way of getting somebody else to explain how they're reaching those figures, whatever that figure might be. Personally, for me, and you ask for an honest way for a calculation, I think the most important calculation for me when I'm looking at this on investment is the return on capital employed. And the way I'm calculating that is, what return am I getting on the money that's tied up in that deal? So let's say it's producing £10,000 a year profit after all mortgage costs and everything else, whatever the property might be. Let's just say, assuming it's generating £10,000. And let's say I've got £50,000 tied up in that project. Let's say I purchased a property, I added value and refinanced it, and I've got cash out, but I've still got 50 grand tied up in that project. So at that point, my calculation of £10,000 net profit each year, based on how much cash I've got tied up in the property, i.e. £50,000, as a percentage gives me the return on capital employed, which in this case will be 20%. So what that means is I'm making 20% return on the £50,000. The reason I like to use that calculation, because it's a direct comparison that I can use for other things. So for example, if there's another opportunity cost, there's something else that I can look at as an investment. Let's say it's leave the money in the bank and put the money in the bank. What's the bank pay? Well, probably not even 1%, and say that's 1% a year versus 20%. You see, it's a direct comparison. Not that those two are probably a great comparison, but you can compare one against the other. You're comparing like for like, apples with apples, as it were. So I know on a 20% return over 5 years, that money I've extracted back out, I've had my initial investment back in. Now, there's other things to consider as well. How long was my money tied up initially? Was it 6 months, 12 months before I got to the point where I was able to refinance and get the money out and then look on the return on capital employed? But whatever method you're using, I think it's important to use one that's meaningful for you. And for me, as I said, the return on capital employed is the key one. I work with a lot of investors. A lot of investor cash goes into my deals, whether it's a loan, whether it's a joint venture partnership. So for me, that figure is quite important to work out what's the return we're going to achieve for the investor. Often the return for me is infinite. Why is it infinite? I hear you ask. The reason it'll be infinite, because if somebody else is funding the deal, and earlier we were talking about no money down, and I'm generating, say, 10 or 12% return on their money, so the return on capital employed for them might be that 10 or 12%. But the return for me is infinite because I actually haven't put any money in. So the return I'm making is pure profit without having any capital tied up in the deal. So there's many different ways to measure these things. There's many metrics, but pick the ones that are useful and meaningful for you and use those. And when you're speaking to other people and they're using these fancy terms, don't just assume that we know how they calculate them. Ask the question, understand how are they calculating them, and even ask why they feel that's an important metric to use, because that way you get a sense of understanding why people are using separate and different metrics to measure the return on property investing. So hopefully that helps, Stephen. So how are we doing for time, Khalid? Okay, so so I've got a question here on Facebook from Roger. What's the best practice to controlling a site for an investor? Option agreement. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but let me try and answer the question I think you're asking. So as a potential investor, you're interested in acquiring a site, but you want some control on that before you can move forward. That might be to purchase it, that might be to go and get planning, that might be to go and get another buyer. You need some kind of control on that site before you go and do these things. Otherwise, if you just go off and get planning permission, you and the seller decides they're not longer going to sell to you, they're going to sell to somebody else, you've lost out. You're trying to sell the deal onto somebody else, it's sidestepped by another investor, they take it over. So by having control, you're protecting yourself against all these things. And an option agreement is really a right to buy type document. And what that means is that the seller has agreed to sell it to you within a certain time frame for a certain price. That's all an option agreement is. And normally you have to pay some kind of consideration. That could be anything from £1 upwards. People talk about buy a property for £1. That's what they're referring to. The pound is not the ownership, but the control it gives you over that asset. And we've heard, many businesses in the commercial world being sold for £1. Like, for example, British Home Stores, I think, was sold for £1. Why was it sold for £1? Because they're actually selling the debt with it as well. So the context of selling things for £1 or having £1 added to it is quite common. That's how you get the control. So the pound is just giving you control over that property. Now, as I said, it could be £1, but it may not be £1. It might be significantly, excuse me, it might be significantly more that you're having to pay depending on what the arrangement is with that site. So the option agreement is one way to control the site. The most common method is very, as I said, very familiar for people in the commercial space. In residential, particularly in probably the last maybe 10 years or so, it's become more common in the residential space, because when I learned this probably about 10-ish years ago, about option contracts and lease option agreements and how to use them. So it's become a bit of a growth area in that time. And the reason really there became a growth strategy, option contracts and lease options, is because it became more difficult to raise finance and borrow money, particularly when the markets had crashed and the banks were kind of sitting on their hands and not lending any money. People found more creative ways of doing deals, and lease options was one of those ways, and option contracts even the control. So option contract is one way to control the site. Another way is just a lockout agreement. A lockout agreement is essentially just saying, look, it's given you the right to be able to do something here without anybody else getting involved. Yeah, so the seller is giving you some exclusivity. And in fact, some documents will be called an exclusivity document or an exclusivity agreement, which essentially is a lockout agreement. So that's another way it can be done as well. Personally, I think the option agreement is the most strongest way to do it. You can also partner up with the person that owns the site. So for example, it could be a joint venture agreement with the owner of the site, meaning that you're going to do something to add value or something else, and you'll get a share of that profit. So there's a number of different ways that it can be done. Pretty much all of them are some kind of legal contract that you're putting into place. And people talk about just getting a copy on the online or Googling it to get a copy. I think, look, if you're doing a deal and it involves a significant amount of money and you want to make sure that that deal works, I'd encourage you to pay a solicitor, get the contract drafted properly, because the reality is, if things start going wrong, it's that contract that's going to protect you and make sure that you get paid for what you're doing. So I'm getting indication we've kind of reached time. There's still quite a few questions I haven't been able to answer. Hopefully you got your question answered, and if you haven't, I'll make sure next week when we do this Monday 8:30, I'll start with the questions that have been unanswered from today first before I jump onto those. Let me know if you find this useful. Put a comment in the section below if this is useful, or am I just rambling on and on? Are you learning anything from this? Is this something you want me to continue doing? Because if you do, I'll happily carry on. If you're finding these of no value to you, then again, let me know. And maybe I'll call it a day with these and not do any more of these. So let me know. Put your comments in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you again next Monday. Thanks so much.